December 7, 1941, Tokyo, Japan. From his office overlooking the Imperial Palace, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto observed the city alive with excitement. Word of the strike on Pearl Harbor had reached Tokyo, and the streets were filled with celebrations. Within the previous 12 hours, Japanese aircraft carriers had executed a devastating assault on the American naval base. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed, roughly 2,400 U.S. personnel had perished, and 350 planes were lost. On paper, the operation was flawless, a demonstration of precision and audacity. Yet Yamamoto felt a deep unease, not triumph. While political leaders and fellow officers hailed the raid as a crippling blow to the U.S. Navy, Yamamoto understood a more sobering reality. This success might hasten Japan's ultimate defeat. Having spent considerable time in the United States, far more than any of his peers, he had witnessed American industrial might firsthand. He had toured Pittsburgh's steel mills, observing furnaces producing in a single day what Japan could not match in a month. He had driven through Detroit, seeing endless assembly lines rolling out vehicles with efficiency that Japanese factories could not replicate. He had visited California's Central Valley, where farms generated enormous food surpluses sufficient to feed millions. While Japan struggled to sustain its population, Yamamoto knew the U.S. could mobilize resources on a scale unimaginable to his colleagues. The first indication of this shift came on January 6, 1942. Just a month after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed Congress with a State of the Union speech outlining staggering production goals. Japanese intelligence monitoring the address dismissed them as fantasy. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, 45,000 tanks in 1942, 75,000 in 1943. 20,000 anti-aircraft guns in 1942, 35,000 in 1943, 6 million tons of merchant shipping in 1942, 10 million tons in 1943. These were 2-year targets, but even interpreting them correctly, the scale was extraordinary. For context, Japan had produced about 5,000 planes in 1941, while the United States had already built nearly 19,000. Roosevelt's vision demanded output far beyond Japan's imagination. Yamamoto had foreseen the danger months before the attack. In a private conversation with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, he warned that while Japan could fight effectively for the first 6 months, extending the conflict for 2 or 3 years would be disastrous. His caution was ignored. The army dismissed it as defeatist. Japanese planners assumed American society was fractured, complacent, and incapable of sustained war effort. They were gravely mistaken. Within weeks, the U.S. industrial machine began an extraordinary transformation. On January 16, 1942, the War Production Board was formed, granting Chairman Donald Nelson near-total authority over industrial conversion. Factories, raw materials, and production lines were redirected toward military needs at a pace that stunned even Americans. Automobile manufacturers exemplified this shift. On February 10, 1942, General Motors produced its last civilian car. By that night, the same assembly lines were adapted for tank production. Ford's Willow Run facility, constructed for B-24 bombers, was operational by March, producing 1 bomber every 63 minutes at peak capacity. Chrysler, Studebaker, Packard, and all major car makers ceased civilian production entirely, instead supplying tanks, aircraft engines, artillery, and other war materiel in volumes Japanese planners considered impossible. In the conversion of the auto industry, America's unique flexibility illustrated its advantage. Equipment, labor skills, and industrial infrastructure could be repurposed quickly. Factories that once built car engines could manufacture aircraft engines. Workers trained on transmissions could assemble tank drivetrains. Japan had no equivalent system. Its military production depended on specialized plants with little adaptability, making it impossible to match the scale or speed of U.S. output. In short, the tactical triumph at Pearl Harbor set in motion a chain of events that would overwhelm Japan not on the battlefield, but in factories, shipyards, and assembly lines, where the true capacity for sustained modern warfare was realized. When Japanese aircraft factories were bombed, their destruction could not be quickly remedied or replaced. In contrast, American factories, even when already running at full capacity, could be expanded or newly built in a matter of months. From the outset, the scale of U.S. production exceeded what Japan had anticipated. In 1942, American plants produced 47,000 military aircraft, short of President Roosevelt's target of 60,000, yet nearly 10 times Japan's annual output of roughly 5,000 planes. By 1943, production climbed to 85,000 aircraft, still below the ambitious 125,000 goal, but surpassing the total number of military planes that existed globally just a decade prior. These numbers included not only fighters and bombers, but also transport planes, reconnaissance aircraft, trainers, gliders, and specialized types that Japan rarely manufactured. By 1944, American aircraft output peaked at 96,000, and by the end of the war in 1945, total production reached 297,000 planes. During the same period, Japan, despite mobilizing all available industry and imposing severe hardships on civilians, produced 85,611 aircraft from 1941 to 1945. The ratio of U.S. to Japanese aircraft production stayed above 3-to-1 over 4 years of maximum effort. This gap was more than numerical. It reflected fundamentally different industrial strategies. The United States waged a war based on material abundance, willing to accept losses from accidents, mechanical failures, or combat, confident replacements could be rapidly produced. Japan, in contrast, fought a war constrained by scarcity, carefully rationing resources, unable to make up for losses, and watching its forces diminish despite any battlefield victories. The transformation extended beyond numbers. It required an unprecedented restructuring of American society. Boeing's Seattle facility illustrates this vividly. Before Pearl Harbor, it employed 4,000 workers producing aircraft slowly. Within 3 years, the workforce expanded to 30,000, operating around the clock in 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Similar expansions occurred at all major defense contractors. This surge drew workers from all walks of life. Women, who had been less than 1% of aviation industry employees pre-war, made up over 10% by mid-1942, 30% by early 1943, and in some plants reached 65% by 1945. The cultural icon Rosie the Riveter reflected this reality. Women performed all tasks once reserved for men, from welding and riveting to engine assembly, quality control, and operating heavy machinery, often while managing homes and families. Their contribution was essential to meeting production goals. African Americans, long excluded from skilled industrial work, found new opportunities in defense plants following Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 in 1941, which banned racial discrimination in war industries. Though barriers remained, the labor demands of total war integrated over 1 million African Americans into the workforce, providing skills, wages, and a foundation for post-war civil rights activism. Teenagers, retirees, and disabled individuals also joined the labor force, contributing wherever they could. By 1944, more than 18 million Americans, nearly 1 in 7, were employed in defense-related industries. The Liberty Ship program exemplified American industrial ingenuity. These cargo vessels, designed for rapid construction using standardized parts and semi-skilled labor, were produced at unprecedented speeds. The SS Robert E. Peary, built in under 5 days, was an extreme demonstration, but even the normal 42 to 50-day construction schedule was revolutionary. At the program's peak in 1943, shipyards launched 3 Liberty ships daily, totaling 75 per month. By the end of the war, 7,270 Liberty ships had been completed, collectively providing more cargo capacity than Japan's entire merchant fleet at the war's outset. Japan, even at full production, could only manage around 15 ships per month. This disparity had strategic consequences. The U.S. could support global operations, supply allies, and sustain civilian life at home, while Japan struggled to maintain its supply lines and lost most of its merchant fleet to American submarines, reducing it to about 10% of pre-war tonnage. The outcome of the war had become mathematically impossible for Japan to reverse. Yet Japanese leaders refused to confront this reality. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, a key planner of the Pearl Harbor attack, noted in his diary in March 1942 the gap between expectation and the emerging industrial power of the United States. Within just 3 months of the war's outset, Japanese forces managed to achieve tactical surprise. Yet there were immediate warnings from some officers that this success might come at a strategic cost. Contrary to expectations, American forces were not collapsing. Instead, they were regrouping, consolidating, and growing more determined. Concerns raised by dissenting officers were quietly sidelined as the Japanese High Command favored unquestioning adherence to the belief in inevitable victory. By May 1942, 5 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Battle of the Coral Sea marked the first substantial obstacle to Japanese expansion. The Japanese intended to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea to establish air bases capable of threatening Australia, completing their defensive perimeter. American and Australian forces intercepted the invasion, leading to the first carrier versus carrier engagement in naval history, where ships never visually sighted one another. While losses were relatively balanced, Japan lost the light carrier Shokaku, while the American carrier Lexington was sunk. The strategic outcome favored the Allies. Japan also suffered the loss of roughly 90 aircraft and 77 highly trained pilots, a deficit they could not quickly replace due to the prolonged and rigorous nature of their pilot training programs. Meanwhile, American aircraft production and pilot training operated at an unprecedented pace, giving the U.S. a decisive advantage in sustained attrition. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, in early June 1942, the Battle of Midway decisively shifted the trajectory of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto committed 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, each brimming with veteran aviators who had gained combat experience across China, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean. Individually and collectively, these pilots and their aircraft were superior to the American forces at the time. However, intelligence breakthroughs proved decisive. American codebreakers at Pearl Harbor had deciphered Japanese operational plans, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to position the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown in a strategic ambush northeast of Midway Island. The battle's outcome was rapid and devastating. In the morning of June 4th, 3 U.S. dive bomber squadrons arrived over Japanese carriers caught mid-preparation for attacks. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were engulfed in fire, their ammunition and fueled aircraft igniting catastrophic explosions. Hiryu launched a counterstrike that damaged Yorktown but was later destroyed. Japan lost all 4 carriers and roughly 250 to 320 aircraft, along with about 110 experienced pilots. These losses were irrecoverable in the short term. American losses included the Yorktown, later sunk by a submarine, and 307 personnel, but the U.S. retained overwhelming industrial and strategic potential. Over the next 3 years, the production disparity became increasingly decisive. By June 1945, Japan managed to complete only 6 new fleet carriers, whereas the U.S. launched 17 Essex-class carriers, each more capable, faster, and larger than Japanese designs. Aircraft production, too, revealed an enormous imbalance. By war's end, the U.S. had manufactured 297,000 military aircraft, while Japan produced just over 85,000, including pre-war production. American planes were generally larger, more heavily armed, and technologically advanced. This industrial superiority extended across all sectors. Tank production starkly illustrated the gap. The U.S. built 86,000 tanks, including 33,000 Shermans with substantial firepower and armor, while Japan produced only 6,500 light and underpowered tanks. Logistics were equally skewed. American forces deployed over 2 million military trucks, enabling highly mobile operations, while Japanese armies relied heavily on rail, coastal shipping, and human porters. Naval and merchant shipbuilding further highlighted the disparity. The U.S. launched roughly 6,800 vessels during the war, compared to fewer than 1,000 by Japan. Submarine campaigns amplified the effect, with American submarines sinking 60% of Japanese merchant shipping and 30% of the fleet, choking Japan's access to oil, rubber, iron, and food. By August 1945, Japan retained less than 10% of its merchant fleet. The scale and integration of American production, combined with technological sophistication and organizational efficiency, created an insurmountable strategic advantage. Systems such as the B-29 Superfortress bomber exemplified this. Designed to strike the Japanese home islands from long-range bases, it demonstrated the industrial depth and strategic foresight that Japan could not match. Ultimately, the combination of irrecoverable pilot and carrier losses, overwhelming production capacity, and logistical superiority rendered Japan's defeat inevitable. Boeing developed the B-29 bomber to transport large bomb payloads over distances of up to 3,000 miles while flying at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, beyond the effective reach of most Japanese fighters. The aircraft represented a pinnacle of complexity for World War II aviation and arguably the most advanced production plane of its era. Each bomber was assembled from more than 40,000 parts, ranging from massive engine components to minuscule electrical switches. Its construction consumed roughly 12 tons of aluminum, along with significant amounts of copper, steel, rubber, and rare metals such as magnesium, which were difficult for Japan to obtain. The plane's four Wright R3350 engines, each rated at 2,200 horsepower, enabled speeds up to 350 miles per hour at operational altitudes. A pressurized cockpit allowed crew members to work without heavy heated suits, while remotely controlled gun turrets, guided by analog computers, provided defensive firepower. With a maximum bomb load of 20,000 pounds, the B-29 could carry the equivalent of 20 fighter planes worth of ordnance over 3,000 miles, striking targets previously beyond reach and bringing war directly to Japanese cities and industries. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States produced approximately 4,000 B-29s, a testament to industrial output and technological sophistication that Japan could not match. The scale of American industrial mobilization became evident as the B-29s were produced alongside thousands of other aircraft types, including fighters, medium bombers, and transports. Strategic bombing against Japan showcased not only production capacity, but also the limitations of Japanese resistance once American industry reached full wartime output. Operations intensified in November 1944 when B-29s stationed on the Mariana Islands began regular missions against Japanese industrial centers. Early efforts focused on high-altitude precision strikes, but results were hampered by weather, navigation difficulties, and Japan's dispersed industry. In March 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay shifted tactics to low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids on urban areas with catastrophic results. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th to 10th, 1945 involved 334 B-29s, dropping 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs, creating a firestorm that destroyed 16 square miles of the city and killed roughly 100,000 people in a single night, more than the casualties from the atomic bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, boiling water and melting glass. Residents seeking safety in water were scalded, those in buildings were incinerated, and those fleeing into the streets suffocated or were consumed by flames. Subsequent raids targeted Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, and numerous smaller cities. Leaflets warning of impending attacks preceded many strikes, amplifying psychological pressure and highlighting Japan's inability to defend civilians. Japanese fighter forces, depleted by years of attrition, were unable to challenge American bombers effectively. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 further illustrated the imbalance between American production and Japanese tactics. Occurring 2 years after Midway, the battle coincided with the U.S. invasion of the Mariana Islands, which would provide bases for B-29 operations. Japan launched Operation Ago with 9 carriers aiming to halt the invasion, but Japanese naval aviation, once the world's most capable, had been eroded by attrition. Veteran pilots had been replaced with inexperienced recruits, resulting in devastating losses. On June 19, 1944, more than 600 Japanese planes were destroyed, while the U.S. lost approximately 20 aircraft, yielding a staggering exchange ratio over 20-1. American industry could replace these aircraft within days, while Japan faced months-long production constraints, compounded by an irreplaceable shortage of trained pilots. The battle effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic threat. By late 1944, Japanese carriers largely served as decoys, carrying few operational aircraft. Remaining ships were immobilized due to fuel shortages, and Japan's naval power was effectively neutralized. Women played a critical role in American industrial output, a social mobilization unmatched in Japan. Before the war, U.S. women were largely confined to domestic roles or light employment. With millions of men serving in the military, defense industries faced severe labor shortages. The War Manpower Commission coordinated recruitment, and the Rosie the Riveter campaign became a cultural symbol of women entering factories. By 1943, over 6 million women worked in defense industries, comprising roughly 35% of the workforce, and in some aircraft factories, 65%. Women performed welding, operated hydraulic presses, assembled complex engines, read technical blueprints, conducted quality control, and managed heavy equipment. This expanded workforce profoundly altered American society, granting women economic independence, skills, and confidence. Japan, in contrast, lacked a comparable mobilization. Cultural norms and the absence of a labor surplus limited female involvement in heavy industry. Japanese women primarily contributed through agriculture, light manufacturing, and civil defense. Japan's smaller population and industrial base made total war unsustainable at U.S. comparable levels. The Manhattan Project epitomized America's industrial and scientific capability. Employing over 130,000 people in secrecy, it cost around $2 billion, exceeding Japan's entire wartime defense budget in some years. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, built for uranium enrichment, consumed 1/17 of U.S. electricity at peak operation. Hanford, Washington, produced plutonium in reactors of unprecedented scale, requiring continuous Columbia River water cooling. These facilities represented immense industrial feats and enabled the development of atomic weapons that would decisively end the war. The Manhattan Project was a wholly experimental undertaking, grounded in scientific theories that were only partially understood and reliant on engineering feats never attempted on such a scale. The laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico, became the central hub where scientists and engineers developed the actual atomic bombs. J. Robert Oppenheimer led a team of exceptionally talented scientists, many of whom had fled Nazi-occupied Europe, working under intense pressure to complete the weapons before Germany could. Ironically, it was only after the war that it became clear Germany never came close to producing a bomb. German nuclear efforts had been abandoned in early 1942 when calculations showed that building a functional weapon would demand resources far beyond what Germany could divert from conventional military production. No other nation combined the necessary scientific knowledge, technical expertise, and industrial infrastructure to carry out a project of this magnitude. Britain possessed strong scientists but lacked industrial capacity. The Soviet Union had theoretical brilliance but limited technological capability. Germany initially had an advantage but halted its program. Japan had some leading physicists but lacked uranium, industrial infrastructure, and organizational capacity for a program of this size. Only the United States had the complete combination: scientific expertise, industrial strength, electricity, rare materials, engineering skill, financial resources, and the organizational ability to coordinate operations across dozens of locations involving hundreds of companies and over 130,000 workers. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay, commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, delivered the uranium-based bomb Little Boy over Hiroshima. The explosion, equivalent to roughly 15,000 tons of TNT, killed an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people immediately and devastated about 4 square miles of the city. In the weeks and months that followed, tens of thousands more died from burns and radiation sickness. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second B-29 dropped a plutonium bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki, producing a blast equal to roughly 21,000 tons of TNT. Around 40,000 to 60,000 people were killed instantly, with the hilly terrain reducing the total damage somewhat. These bombings confirmed that Japan could no longer shield its population from American military power. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation for the first time in public, announcing Japan's surrender. He explicitly cited the atomic bombings as a primary reason, warning that the enemy had begun using a new, unimaginably destructive weapon. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2nd on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, officially ending the Pacific War. Analyzing Japan's defeat reveals that the attack on Pearl Harbor, far from being a decisive victory, initiated a chain of events leading to inevitable collapse. Admiral Irisoku Yamamoto had predicted 6 months of initial success followed by insurmountable difficulties, and this timeline proved accurate. The Battle of Midway, occurring exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, from June 4th to 7th, marked the turning point. From that point onward, the overwhelming capacity of American industry rendered Japanese defeat inevitable, regardless of battlefield courage or skill. Japanese strategists compounded their errors through several critical misjudgments. They underestimated American industrial capacity by at least an order of magnitude, assuming it impossible for the United States to mobilize on a large scale. They also believed American society was too soft, divided, and self-indulgent to sustain total war. Yet the Pearl Harbor attack instead unified American resolve for unconditional victory. Japan further assumed that superior training and combat spirit could overcome material shortages, disregarding the attritional realities of industrial warfare. America could replace losses quickly, while Japan could not. Finally, they hoped that early victories would force the U.S. to negotiate, misreading the American determination to fight to total surrender. Japanese forces, trained in a culture that prized spirit over logistics, continued offensive operations even as losses became unsustainable, unable to grasp that industrial output mattered more than morale alone. By contrast, American production steadily increased, supplying not only U.S. forces but also allied nations. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. produced nearly 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million trucks, and roughly 6,800 naval vessels, all while fighting in Europe, maintaining civilian living standards and growing the economy. Gross national product expanded by about 70%, and military supplies extended to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and Free French forces. Japan, even at maximum effort, could not approach this scale. By 1944, Japanese civilians faced extreme rationing, industrial output declined due to raw material shortages exacerbated by submarine blockades, and cities were evacuated to conserve resources. Meanwhile, Americans maintained relative prosperity and expanding industrial output despite wartime demands. Human cost was enormous. Japan suffered an estimated 2.1 to 2.5 million military deaths and 550,000 to 800,000 civilian deaths, with uncertainty due to incomplete records and ongoing debate about atomic and firebombing casualties. U.S. losses in the Pacific totaled roughly 100,000 killed and 300,000 wounded, significant but far smaller in proportion. The difference reflects a fundamental reality. America could endure losses, replenish troops and equipment, and maintain morale, whereas each Japanese casualty represented irreplaceable depletion. By 1945, Japan fielded poorly trained pilots, patched aircraft, and used substitute fuels, while U.S. forces operated superior planes with experienced crews and reliable supplies. Post-war interviews with Japanese officers confirmed the psychological impact of American production. General Kawabe Toriro, a member of the Imperial General Staff, acknowledged that Japan would have needed to multiply industrial output 20-fold to compete, an impossibility given limited resources, labor, technology, and geography. In retrospect, decades after the conflict, it became evident that the key strategic insight should have been clear from the outset. Defeating the United States by military means alone was impossible due to its unparalleled industrial power. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood this reality and tried urgently to convey it to Japan's military and political leaders before hostilities began. Having lived in the United States from 1925 to 1928, studied at Harvard University, traveled extensively across the country, and served as a naval attaché in Washington, he had first-hand knowledge of American industrial capacity. He recognized that once mobilized, it would be unstoppable. Yamamoto's famous prediction of a 6-month window was not derived from battlefield tactics or conventional military planning, but from a calculated assessment of industrial output. Japanese forces could achieve early tactical successes for roughly 6 months, the period necessary for American industry to ramp up, for the military to absorb initial losses, adapt, and respond with overwhelming force. After this point, the sheer scale of U.S. production would decisively tip the balance, independent of Japanese skill or bravery. His forecasts proved accurate, yet his death in April 1943 prevented him from witnessing the full consequences of his warnings or the devastation caused by Japanese leaders' dismissal of them. The industrial mobilization that followed Pearl Harbor reshaped the global balance of power. Factories producing B-29 bombers transitioned to civilian aircraft, laying the groundwork for enduring U.S. aerospace dominance. Shipyards that launched Liberty ships became engines of global trade, constructing tankers and container ships. The war effort demonstrated that economic capacity and efficient organization were as decisive as frontline combat. Workers, engineers, and managers who coordinated these efforts were as critical to victory as soldiers, showing that total war required society-wide engagement. Women welding Liberty ship hulls in Richmond contributed as much to the war effort as Marines storming beaches at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Engineers optimizing assembly lines enabled rapid aircraft production, matching the significance of fighter pilots achieving air superiority. The U.S. mobilization challenged Japanese assumptions that democracy, civil liberties, and dispersed authority would inhibit large-scale wartime production. Pearl Harbor's aftermath illustrates that modern conflict is as dependent on factories and logistics as on battlefield valor. Japan's military was highly trained, tactically adept, and remarkably courageous, yet these qualities could not overcome the opponent's industrial scale. The United States replaced lost aircraft, ships, and equipment faster than Japan could destroy them. This conflict demonstrated that the nation capable of sustained industrial output would prevail regardless of tactical victories or individual heroism. This lesson informed military strategy for decades, influencing both post-war doctrine and Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. Historians now view the Pearl Harbor attack as a catastrophic miscalculation. Japan underestimated U.S. industrial strength by more than an order of magnitude, assuming military prowess and initial victories would force a negotiated settlement. Japanese planners believed American society was too soft, too divided, and too focused on comfort to endure the sacrifices required for total war. Every assumption proved wrong, resulting in Japan's total defeat, occupation, atomic bombings, loss of empire, and profound societal transformation. From Pearl Harbor to Midway, 6 months highlighted the speed and scale of American mobilization. The subsequent 3.5 years underscored the inevitability of U.S. victory once production reached full capacity. Roosevelt's ambitious goals, announced a month after Pearl Harbor, initially dismissed by Japanese intelligence as morale propaganda, were largely met or surpassed within the planned 2-year horizon. Aircraft production approached 10 times Japanese annual output. Tank production nearly met planned totals, and shipping exceeded expectations. Anti-aircraft gun output also met or exceeded targets. The contrast between Japanese expectations and American industrial reality serves as a lasting warning. Misjudging an opponent's capacity, relying on assumptions rather than evidence, and embracing wishful thinking can result in catastrophic failure. Japan's calculations were distorted by incomplete information, cultural bias, and strategic wishful thinking. They believed what they wanted to believe rather than what was true, and paid the ultimate price. Instead of relying on detached calculations of industrial output and strategic resources, Admiral Yamamoto, who had spent time in the United States and had first-hand knowledge of its manufacturing potential, tried urgently to caution Japan about the risks ahead. His concerns, however, were largely ignored, dismissed as pessimism, or seen as a lack of martial resolve. The consequences were catastrophic. Japan suffered a historic defeat, faced foreign occupation for the first time, endured atomic bombings, lost its empire, and underwent a profound transformation of its political system and society. The scale of American production during the war is staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 297,000 aircraft while conducting operations across multiple continents and oceans. Japan, focused primarily on a single theater, produced just 85,611. In armored vehicles, America rolled out 86,000 tanks, compared with roughly 6,500 by Japan. Naval construction followed a similar pattern. The U.S. launched approximately 6,800 ships, whereas Japan completed fewer than 1,000. Across every category of military output, the disparity was enormous, consistent over 4 years, and decisive in shaping the war's outcome. The true strategic impact of Pearl Harbor is revealed in Japanese reflections. Before his death on April 18, 1943, when his plane was downed over the Guadalcanal area by P-38 Lightning fighters, Yamamoto privately noted that the attack, while tactically effective, was a strategic disaster. The assault destroyed battleships that were visually impressive but increasingly irrelevant in the era of aircraft carriers, and failed to neutralize the carriers that would dominate the Pacific. More importantly, it unified a previously divided American public, transforming ambivalent citizens into a nation ready for total war. What was meant to cripple the U.S. instead unleashed its industrial potential, setting Japan on a path to inevitable defeat. Pearl Harbor triggered what would become the fastest and most comprehensive industrial mobilization in human history. American production capacity, vastly underestimated by Japanese planners, was unleashed with remarkable speed, scale, and efficiency. Factories, managers, engineers, and workers all contributed directly to the war effort. Women welding bomber fuselages, men casting armor, engineers optimizing assembly lines, and supply chains running at peak capacity. From December 1941 to August 1945, these industrial efforts proved as decisive as battlefield victories. Japanese observers were astounded. The output was not mere propaganda or temporary accomplishment, it was the result of careful planning, resource coordination, and sustained execution. The 6 months from the attack on Pearl Harbor to the Battle of Midway demonstrated that modern war could be determined as much by industrial might as by tactics. Nations confronting opponents with overwhelming manufacturing power faced extreme risk. Yet American mobilization was unique in that it relied on democratic mechanisms rather than authoritarian command. Participation was largely voluntary, incentivized economically, and reinforced by social and patriotic pressure. Defense industry jobs offered competitive wages, women gained independence and purpose, and African Americans accessed previously closed opportunities. The alignment of individual and national goals allowed production to surge without coercion. The War Production Board, first under Donald Nelson and later Julius Krug in 1944, coordinated this extraordinary effort. It allocated scarce resources, set production priorities, resolved conflicts between competing demands, and ensured maximum efficiency across factories. Though comparable levels of planning were once associated only with totalitarian states, the U.S. managed it within democratic constraints, negotiating with industry leaders, responding to political pressures, and maintaining public support. The transformation was remarkable given the starting point. In 1941, American industry was designed for civilian products. Factories needed conversion, workers required retraining, supply chains had to be reorganized, and management systems for peacetime production were insufficient for wartime demand. Yet within months, production surged beyond what Japanese intelligence had deemed possible. Planners had assumed that democracy would slow mobilization, that labor disputes, racial divisions, and political fragmentation would hinder coordination. Instead, the rapid, unified, and effective mobilization shattered all these expectations. In sum, the attack on Pearl Harbor unleashed a chain of events that ensured Japan's defeat. It activated an industrial engine that Japan could not hope to match, demonstrating that in modern warfare, production capacity and societal mobilization are as decisive as battlefield strategy and tactics. The massive influx of women into American factories during World War II disrupted traditional gender norms, revealing skills and capabilities previously overlooked by pre-war society. Similarly, African Americans entering industrial jobs and serving in the military confronted racial barriers, sowing early seeds for the civil rights movements that would reshape the nation in subsequent decades. Shared wartime experiences, collaborating toward common objectives, and making personal sacrifices for the collective good strengthened a sense of national unity and demonstrated that democratic societies could mobilize efficiently without compromising individual freedoms. The Japanese military leadership fundamentally misjudged this aspect of American society. They assumed democracy fostered weakness, freedom led to decadence, and individualism would hinder coordinated effort. Pearl Harbor proved these assumptions catastrophically wrong. The attack triggered a surge of American resolve, enabling the United States to organize and produce at levels that surpassed Japanese authoritarian control. American individualism, when directed toward national goals, proved more effective than rigid conformity. The nation's diversity, harnessing talent and energy across all social groups, produced far greater output than Japan's homogeneous society. These lessons extended well beyond World War II, influencing Cold War strategy, military planning, and national power calculations for decades. Success in prolonged conflicts required the capacity to mobilize industry, organize production, and sustain output, advantages that became central to post-war competition, from arms races to space exploration. The patterns established during the Pacific War, where industrial might determined victory, were mirrored in the Cold War, as American economic strength ultimately outpaced Soviet capacity despite technological gaps in certain military sectors. Behind these statistics were countless personal stories that illustrate the human dimension of mobilization. The teenage girl from Iowa who left school to weld Liberty ship hulls, earning wages that supported her family while discovering new abilities. The African-American man from Mississippi who moved to Detroit, leaving sharecropping behind for factory work that tripled his income. The grandmother from Oregon who returned from retirement to inspect aircraft components, applying decades of experience to ensure pilots could fly safely. Individually unarmed and distant from combat, these civilians were nonetheless as vital to the war effort as soldiers on the front lines. Their contributions proved that modern warfare demanded total societal involvement, that home front production could be as decisive as battlefield success, and that victory required mobilization beyond military engagement. The industrial and social transformations initiated during this period had lasting effects. The wartime production infrastructure fueled post-war prosperity, while the expanded roles of women and African Americans accelerated social change. Demonstrating that democratic societies could mobilize effectively provided both ideological and practical models for Cold War strategy. Japan learned these lessons through catastrophic defeat and occupation, eventually reconstructing itself into a prosperous, democratic, industrialized nation. Japanese leaders who survived recognized that national strength derived from production, cooperation, and freedom rather than conquest, coercion, or authoritarianism. The United States' wartime industrial output redefined the nature of modern conflict. From Pearl Harbor to Midway, it became clear that tactical brilliance and surprise attacks could not overcome overwhelming production capacity. Between December 1941 and June 1942, American factories shifted from peacetime to wartime production at unprecedented speed. Automobile plants halted civilian production, aircraft output surged, and shipyards launched vessels faster than ever before. By Midway, the U.S. delivered a strategic blow that Japan could not recover from, underscoring the decisive role of industrial mobilization. Reports of American production astonished Japanese intelligence as the scale and pace exceeded all expectations. Over the next 3 years, production continued to grow, sustaining military operations across multiple theaters while maintaining civilian prosperity, an achievement unmatched by any other nation during World War II. American forces advanced across the Pacific with material superiority, while submarines and aircraft effectively disrupted Japanese supply lines and dominated the skies. By 1945, Japan faced total collapse. Cities were destroyed by strategic bombing, industry was shattered, food shortages threatened starvation, and military forces were depleted and ill-equipped. Yet Japanese leadership persisted until the atomic bombings demonstrated the futility of continued resistance. The contrast between Japanese expectations in 1941 and reality in 1945 could not have been more dramatic. From confident aggressors anticipating quick victories, they became a defeated and occupied nation within 4 years, primarily due to the United States' unmatched industrial capacity. Factories, not just battlefields, determined the outcome of the Pacific War. America's ability to produce rapidly, efficiently, and in overwhelming quantity was decisive, establishing its dominance in the region for generations and demonstrating that modern warfare would be won as much in factories as in combat.